Welcome, everyone. I'm Sean Renee Graham, Deputy Director of the Field, and welcome to our webinar, The Rent is Due May 1st, Now What? Very grateful today to have our guest talk about some issues related to both commercial and residential leaders. Randi Berry from IndieSpace, Erez, Paul Leibowitz, and Adam Meyers. Just want to start by acknowledging the land and our ancestors. We open this gathering and space by invoking the reverence and respect, acknowledging and thanking the original caretakers of this land we are standing on today or sitting on, the ancestors that continue to live with us. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Lenape people and many others for whom this land was home and a communal gathering space. We must also honor the enslaved Africans whose free labor is the catalyst for this country's wealth and whose artistic practices are, in many cases, the basis for our dominant forms of contemporary popular culture. And now I'll hand it over to Randi Berry.
Thank you so much, Sean Renee. Hi, everybody. I'm Randi Berry. I'm the Executive Director of IndieSpace and the Indie Theater Fund. I'm joined by my partners and co-founders of IndieSpace, Paul Leibowitz, who is a Senior Managing Director at Savills. He's a born and raised New Yorker and culture lover, and he sees more indie theater than anybody I've ever met. And also by Erez. Yeah, and also by Erez. Erez is the Artistic Managing Director of Frigid New York. He operates the Crane and Under St. Mark's venues in the East Village, and which are staples in the indie theater community. I'll introduce Adam Meyers in just a second, but I'm going to share my screen so we can talk a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about IndieSpace, and we'll talk with Adam about residential real estate law, and then we'll open this up for questions and answers. We just wanted to get a little bit of the more general information out to you first, so that way we could get into more specifics later on in the conversation. So let me just share my screen. Everybody, you're good? Okay, so rent is due. Now what? I just introduced you to our founding partners, Paul, Erez, and I. IndieSpace creates permanent real estate solutions for the independent theater community by delivering affordable and sustainable creative space for a diversity of performing artists, along with free advisory and consulting services. IndieSpace will preserve and enhance this vital piece of the cultural landscape of New York. Paul, Erez, and I started IndieSpace at the end of 2016 to provide these permanent real estate solutions. I'm an artist myself, and I was working in commercial real estate during the day, and then I was rehearsing in the vacant spaces of the buildings we were selling at night. I was working hard to find affordable space to perform and having a very difficult time. So Paul saw those challenges that I was facing, and he approached me about starting an organization that could provide below-market theater space and that could use our resources, network, and knowledge to further establish artists in New York City. We partnered up with Erez, who operates 2 theaters and had space management experience, and IndieSpace was born. Our goal is to provide a permanent stake for artists in the neighborhoods that they're living in, give under-resourced venues and artists a chance to survive in this red-hot real estate market, and make connections, give free tools, and empower artists and organizations to thrive on their own. That's what we do when there isn't a global pandemic happening. So in the last month and a half, we've been in triage mode. We've been meeting the way that we're going to meet with you today. We've been meeting one-on-one with all of the venues in our advisory and consulting program, advocating for artists and venues that are in serious danger of closing their doors permanently after this pandemic. And, losing their creative and, in a lot of cases, their homes. So Adam Meyers is also here with us. Adam is an attorney at Communities Resist, a nonprofit law office representing tenants and associations in North Brooklyn. Adam's been working for low-income tenants in New York and Massachusetts since 2011 and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. Adam should be able to answer your legal residential questions. We understand that while some of us operate a space, nearly all of us need to be in our homes. So that's who we are, and we wanted to share with you what we know so far. I'm going to start with a little caveat that every lease and every landlord relationship is different. So below we're going to share general rules, but each communication needs to be viewed through the lens of what you know about your lease, residential or commercial, and what you know about your relationship with your landlord, residential or commercial. So we know that residential and commercial rents are still technically due. There hasn't been any legislation passed at this point that frees us from paying our residential or commercial rents legally. There are bills in state legislature and one that was introduced federally to cancel rent, residential and small business commercial rent. Neither has been passed. I did also read something this morning that a few of the borough presidents have come together to try to pass something that allows, although Adam will talk about this later maybe, that would allow tenants to ask their landlords to use their security deposit towards their May rent. We do know that courts are closed until at least June 20th, and so evictions and pending eviction proceedings are suspended until the courts reopen. Landlords may still send rent bills and past due notices as if everything is business as usual, but they cannot take you to court or begin eviction proceedings until the courts reopen. So, with that information, what can you do right now? For commercial tenants, we recommend that you start by looking at your lease. There are several provisions in your lease that may prove to be a helpful negotiating tool at the end of this, this pandemic, but also might be something that you could point to in conversations with your landlord now. Some of the clauses in your lease that may have a nugget for you to start a conversation with are deprivation of access or services. The lease sometimes allows a tenant to pay no or lower rent for a period of time where the tenant is unable to use the building. Force majeure. Leases sometimes excuse a tenant from performing its obligations where it's prevented from doing so by factors outside of its control. The problem is a pandemic or a virus are often not included in some of these clauses, but they are a conversation starter. Casualty. Leases often permit a tenant to terminate or avoid paying rent because the building is damaged in a fire or other casualty. The standard casualty provision is typically applied in instances of actual physical damage rather than the presence of a threat of a contagious disease. Or condemnation. Leases often permit a tenant to terminate or avoid paying rent because a government takes over the building. It is far from clear that a shelter-in-place or similar orders represents a taking for this purpose. You may also want to check your insurance policy in the case of commercial tenants. Your policy, most exclude viruses, but you may want to file a claim for your insurance either way. Business interruption insurance covers losses from an event that forces companies to suspend business activities. Civil authority covers losses when a governmental agency stops a business from operating. So in both commercial and residential situations, you would want to be communicating with your landlord. Something that we suggest, though, is that in any moment that you're communicating with your landlord, even if the conversation is friendly, we would suggest that you operate as if there may be a court case at the end of this period of time. So we suggest you put things in writing, refer to your lease, and in the case of commercial leases, when speaking about the closure, always refer to the government-mandated shutdown. Do not refer to you closed your space for the safety of your audience because you care about your artists. you must always relate it back to the executive order by the governor and the emergency executive order by the mayor. That way you can always point back to the legal precedent that was set in order for you not to be able to operate your business. So we have, which I'm happy to send you, we have several drafts of landlord notices that can be sent to your landlords. Some are friendly and just letting them know that you're not willfully defaulting, that you've paid, in the case that you have paid rent, that you've paid rent on time up until this point, that you were forced to close, business is illegal at this time. And then there's other notices that we have drafted that are a little bit more confrontational, I would say. So we, depending on your relationship with your landlord and the situation that you're in, we can send you, and we'll send you after this, if you'd like, template notices that you can send to your landlord. In your notice, you want to refer to your lease, point to the clauses in your lease that I mentioned above, mention terms. You want to check and make sure there's no abandonment clause in your lease. An abandonment clause may say that if you are not in operations of your business for some period of time, that you are abandoning your business. And then we suggest that you give options to work with your landlord, that you're willing to provide letters of support for their relief, work with them on a payment plan going forward, but do what you can to try and offer the option of a collaboration for their relief that then could be passed on to you in rent forgiveness. Some of the options that you can give them, and the one that we would love to see, is that they waive your rent completely, cancel rent, or reduce rent payments for a period of time without requiring you to pay any missed rent later. We know that deferring rent is going to be a hurdle that most of our small venues can't get through. That some may have already been in arrears before this even started, and having to open up without guaranteed income, and because we know that it will take some time before we start seeing full houses again in our theaters, deferring rent can be problematic, but it is an option. Deferring rent, giving tenant extra time, paying no rent or lower rent for 1 or more months, and then paying the missed rent later this year, sometime next year, or at the end of the term of your lease. Extending the term and having a free rent period now. Some landlords do give a free rent period at the beginning of a lease or when a lease is signed or renewed. So we could maybe ask the landlord to give us that free rent period now and then extend our lease for whatever months, so that we can pay these missing months at the end of the term of our lease. Or we can terminate and give up the premises with paying or not paying a termination fee. So for right now, in our opinion, many commercial tenants are not paying rent at this time. Large retailers like The Gap, Urban Outfitters, and Cheesecake Factory have stated that they will not pay rent while they're not allowed to operate their business. So what we're suggesting at this time, and of course this is a personal choice and there are consequences to each personal choice, but we're asking our venues to ask themselves, if you pay full rent or half rent now for the period of time that you're not in your space, how long can you continue to do that with no income before you close your doors permanently? So there are many tenants that are not paying rent at this time. And so asking ourselves whether or not we should be one of those people that are not paying rent at this time, it's a personal decision, but you would not be alone in that scenario at this time. So I'm going to close that's our piece of general commercial advice. And I'm going to pass it over to Adam Meyers now, who's going to give us a little bit of information about residential real estate.
Good morning, everybody. On the residential side of things, a lot of the same principles apply that Randi was just a commercial context, but I'll spend a couple minutes talking about new have been put in place on the residential side of things, issues that may come up in trying to negotiate with your residential landlord, some bills that are on the horizon that may provide some additional relief down the road. And then wanted to talk a little bit about what folks may be hearing about nationwide or statewide rent strike campaign that is, I think, probably appearing on a lot of our social media. And so at the outset, what are the current protections in place in leases? The big one is that evictions, that's the process of removing somebody paid until like July. And so at this point in time, nobody is getting evicted from their homes. And then in addition to that, even the commencement or litigation of resolution proceedings has been almost entirely stayed. It's not quite accurate to say that the courts closed. They're still opening on a very minimal basis to handle emergency proceedings, like where folks have been illegally locked out of their apartments, or where folks have sort of urgent conditions that need to be repaired in their apartments. So the courts are still technically open, but at this point it's only for emergency cases, and so far courts are not deciding that cases constitute emergency proceedings like that. There has been some pending legislation on the staying eviction front that was introduced by the Speaker of the City Council, Corey Johnson, I think last week, that would potentially stay evictions relating to nonprofit from this period of time as long as a year out from now, which would be important in my view, very helpful. Aside from the legal protections currently in place, what else is going on? Well, you know what else is going on. There are tens of millions of people in this country that are losing their job, depending on who's doing the counting. As much as you know, a third of rent were unable to pay April rent. Presumably May is going to see higher numbers than that as more people have lost jobs or exhausted savings. And so this is meaning, first off, that landlords are sort of getting this on all sides. They're seeing that a ton of their tenants are probably not going to be able to make rent right now. And then in addition, the whole real estate rental market is itself, I think, going into a period of hibernation where folks aren't out buying new homes, folks aren't out renting new apartments. And so with these eviction protections and with the scale of this economic disaster, there's a way to like see that this actually in some ways create some additional leverage for the residential tenant in negotiating with their landlord, because the landlord knows, you know, I can't bring an eviction case right now. When I am allowed to bring eviction cases, it's going to be this guy, it's going to be, you know, 100 of my tenants. And then finally empty, who am I going to rent? It's not going to be able to do the normal New York and back up, you know, in 3 weeks. And in light of all of that, it may be the case that these residential landlords are open to negotiating sort of amicable resolutions with their. You do hear stories of landlords who are completely waiving rent for a certain number of months. I've tenant association, their landlords, you know, partial rent waivers, maybe, you know, 50%, pay 50% of your rent for a month or two, get through this. And then I would imagine every landlord is going to be happy. It's going to be thrilled with getting something in writing from you saying there's a schedule upon which we're going to defer this rent down the road. He said, depending on the nature of your relationship with your landlord, it may be more or less important to get these conversations in writing. If it's sort of an arm's length, very business-like and impersonal relationship with your landlord, do all the stuff in writing, either by letter or by email. If you do a relationship, you can, you know, reach out by phone first. Sometimes it's easier to get to the initial that way, and then you can sort of agreement by email if that's an easier way to do it. Now, what about rent cancellation? so far we've seen some procedural protections for residential tenants, but we haven't yet gotten the actual cancellation of rent. There are a number of pending that would be more helpful or less helpful. Are bills that have been in New York by Senators Gianaris and Salazar, each of which would provide some rent cancellation for tenants lost income as a result of this crisis. There's a bill that was introduced by Senator Kavanaugh that would sort of create basically a new kind of rent subsidy for that lost income as a result of this crisis. I think there's a bill by Senator Hoylman, which would mean it wouldn't exactly cancel rent, but what it would say is if a landlord is owed rent as a result of this crisis, they can sort of go into normal collections for that money. They can, sell the debt to a debt collector, and that person can garnish wages or something like that, but that you couldn't actually evict over that money. It would be what's called a non-possessory judgment. That's another bill that's pending. And then on the federal level, Ilhan Omar proposed a bill that involved some sweeping rent cancellation nationwide. I'm not, maybe other folks on this call have a better sense of how politically viable that is. Getting my hopes up. I would expect the New York legislation to be maybe a bit more viable, but and then to this push for legislation canceling rent is this question of the rent strike, or multiple rent strikes, or what is the rent strike? Obviously, I think most folks know a rent strike is the idea that tenants, a group of tenants, organized manner, come together and agree to withhold their rent in order to achieve a certain, in order to increase pressure, number of their demands. Usually, over the past number of years, the rent strikes that most typically happen have to do with bad conditions in a building or something like that, where tenants say, I need my repairs, I'm not getting my repairs, I'm going to withhold rent until I get my repairs. That's not really what people are talking about right now. What demands here are a little bit different. They're a little bit different. They are aggressive demand in light of this unprecedented situation we're facing. But the demands include, on sort of the level directly with your landlord, demands for rent forgiveness. And they all, the idea is that against demands, and if my campaign becomes big, if it's constantly in the media, if pressure is put on the real estate industry such that corporate landlords calling Governor Cuomo and saying, you need us some sort of relief so that this thing stops, that be an attack that would help achieve political industry. And so there are organizations in New York State, in particular Justice for All, like the New York Right to Counsel Coalition, are advancing and supporting a campaign of rent strike to sort of highlight the inability of a lot of tenants to pay their rent, and to try to turn that when tenants struggle with paying into this collective movement and try to harness some political power from that. If you do a search for Housing Justice for All or for Right to Counsel in New York City, you're going to find websites talking about this and what its purpose is. What its purpose is. That's the basic gist of where we're at right now. I think we're going to take questions, or particular questions that folks have.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. Natalie, do you have questions for us to start?
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie. I'm the program associate at the Field. We do have some questions. We have one from JK quite a bit. If the bill passes to forgive rent, isn't it better to not pay residential rent and wait to see what happens with the bill? And if we pay residential rent and then the bill passes, should we get credit? I guess we should stop there and then continue with their question, since they ask about what to do with the 2-year lease after that.
And so on that issue, it's a bit hard to answer too definitely, because it's not one bill, it's a bunch of bills that are written a bunch of different ways. I think it is fair to say that, as Randi sort of advised in the commercial context, because the courts but closed to proceeding at this point, they're relatively low risk in waiting and seeing at the moment. You know, it's hard to say exactly what would happen if depending on which of these bills would pass. Some of the bills are contingent upon, you know, the particular financial of the tenant in question, and so if somebody has the ability to pay the rent throughout and hasn't really been negatively affected by the COVID crisis, it may be that even a rent cancellation bill that is passed provide them much particular relief. But because we don't know because we don't know what the terms are going to be, yeah, I think it and seeing is reasonable in this
to
moment.
not pay. Yeah,
That's
and
correct.
I would also say it wouldn't be a bad idea if there is some funds, but you don't have the money to pay full rent, to even just put that rent aside in an account so that it's sitting there in the event that something isn't passed, and that you have the ability to pay something at the end of it in order to protect yourself going forward. You know, sometimes during a rent strike, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, tenants will put their rent in an escrow account or a separate account and hold the money there until the landlord meets their demands, and then they can use the money going forward to pay rent. So it's like kind of the way to show a court that you had the ability to pay, but because of the situation, you weren't paying. Is that correct? Yeah.
That is correct. And that's typically the way that a normal rent strike is done. As you know, this is an unusual situation,
Right.
and a lot of the folks that are in this situation, they may not pay because they don't have the money.
Right.
And so, but no, your point is absolutely correct, that you don't want to withhold rent now and then spend it all on things that are unnecessary and then find yourself in deeper trouble in a few months. So to the extent that you've got the means, hold on to it.
Yeah, or even a portion. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, I mean, because Adam was suggesting, and so was Randi, that we're in uncharted territory now. So, I mean, this is just new for everybody. And, you know, I think landlords are going to realize that they don't have many other options other than to give relief to their tenants, because as Adam suggests, having something vacant right now, whether it's commercial or residential, there's absolutely no demand for the time being. So smart landlords, in my belief, are going to, rather than just force people out, are going to negotiate and give some relief with the idea that they believe long-term things will come back to normal and those tenants will continue to pay rent. So clearly there's leverage on behalf of the tenant. I mean, they, you know, landlords of in typical fashion always think they're being taken advantage of. They're not. But, you know, I think those are the prudent landlords are going to have the foresight to give some relief so they don't have, you know, whether it's commercial storefront closure or vacant apartments, because that's going to be the real downside and very difficult to feel probably in the next 6 to 12 months.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, excuse me. So Adam, you're kind of breaking out in audio for a little bit. So just to recap a little bit, is there a bill to forgive rent? Who is sponsoring it? How can we keep up to date with this bill's progress? And what documentation should we have to prove that we were affected by COVID to not pay?
So as I just jotted down in the chat, there are several bills that rent cancellation from different angles. On the York, there are bills sponsored by Senator Salazar, Senator Gianaris, Senator Hoylman in a bit of a different sense, and there's a sort of new rent subsidy bill sponsored by Senator Kavanaugh. On the federal level, Ilhan Omar has put forward a bill for rent cancellation. I don't have the actual bill numbers associated with this in front of me, but there's a lot of discussion online about them, and so if you Google for the sponsors, I think you'll probably be able to find them.
Would this be the same process for stabilized apartments?
I'm sorry?
Would this be the same process for stabilized apartments?
Yeah, as far as I recall, none of the bills that I've looked at have distinguished between pure market rate apartments and stabilized rent controlled apartments. I think they would all fall under them. And you may find slightly different situations, like state-owned housing, like public housing. I'm not sure if the rent cancellation would work quite the same way there, but yeah, for privately owned apartments, I think they'd be the same.
Okay. So we have a participant here who says the following. What if I decide not to return to my NYC apartment, to which they haven't been there since March 7th, and could they get out of their 2-year lease? And what if they decide to break that lease?
It's a little bit of a complicated question. If you've made the decision like that it is just not viable for you to hold on to that, then you're lease, see what the lease says about the term procedures, and then you jump through the hoops at least in order to tell your landlord, I am ending my lease at this point. Now, in the old world, if you terminate a lease early before the term is up, you could potentially be held liable for the rest of the rent owed under that lease. But that law changed last year. And so now the landlord has a duty to, in the law, it's called a duty to mitigate. And the landlord has to try to re-rent that apartment to somebody else. And once he does re-rent that, your sort of rental obligation for the apartment ends. So it's a better situation this year than it would have been last year. It still is potentially an expensive situation. You do want to look closely at the lease, because along the lines that I think Randi was mentioning in the context, there may be ways to argue that the coronavirus gives you sort of an excuse to terminate lease without paying anything additional. Maybe there's a so-called force majeure clause that says when something really big comes up, you can be excused from your performance. You may want to try to arguments like that in there. And then, there's also the human aspect of this. And so when you talk to your landlord about the situation that you're in, we may find that at least some of these landlords are willing to, on more reasonable terms, just not to, viciously profiteer off of a worldwide crisis.
Okay. Someone else asked, in residential, can you use the fact that overall building maintenance is not up to par and can't use the on-site gym, etc.?
Yes. Yeah, in New York State, every lease, whether it's written in there or not, understood to include what's called the warranty of habitability, which means that the landlord has an obligation to keep the building in good repair, provide certain necessary services, etc. And so, yeah, to the extent that the landlord's not providing service that you stated for in that lease, or to the extent that there are repairs that need to be made that are not being made, that can be a defense to paying some or all of your rent.
How should those folks document that, Adam, so that they're prepared for that conversation with their landlord?
So one of the issues in turning that into a viable defense has to do with making sure that the landlord is on.
Is on what? Sorry, it broke up. Is on what?
On notice.
On notice.
And so if there is a repair issue in your apartment that that you don't already know the landlord to be aware of, you could take advantage of this opportunity to shoot the landlord an email saying, hey, there's this issue in my apartment that needs to be repaired. Or you could call 311, which is the city's non-emergency assistance line, and through 311 you can file a complaint with the Department of Housing, Prevention and Development. In addition, what sort of documentation do you want to retain as proof of the issue? You want to, you could take regular photographs of the condition. That's very good proof that it exists. You could, if it's about your gym closing, I'd want to, keep a copy of the notice that you got that the gym was closed in for time, or if it's posted somewhere, snap a photo of it. If there was no notice, but instead just a door that was otherwise open is now locked, snap photos of that.
And as I think I saw somebody also mention, what documentation should you be keeping, at least for commercial? You should keep copies of every email cancellation. If you run a venue, any cancellations of shows going back and forth, any notices that you have or have not received funding. If funders weren't able to kind of fulfill the remainder of a grant that was going to you, any kind of cancellations that allow you to document your loss of income for your space. And I think that also relates to you personally for residential. If you need backup about the losses that you're impacted kind of income and why you can't pay your residential rent, it's important to keep also those emails of presenters canceling your jobs, or your restaurant having closed, or any gigs that were canceled. I've been suggesting people create a file, have printouts or at least emails of all of that, and maybe start a spreadsheet of lost income versus your expenses on a monthly basis. And I always suggest you need to cover your urgent personal expenses first. You must choose to eat first before you choose to pay your rent. And so document everything, all of the expenses that you have personally too.
Okay. We have Lucy S. here. Have they yet addressed the issue on nonprofits that have renters in their spaces, i.e. a theater that hosts a cafe, and are there any bills that have carve-outs or adjustments for nonprofits?
All of these bills, I believe, also cover small businesses, which cover small not-for-profit theaters. So what that would do, though, is only cancel their rent to their landlord. That doesn't actually, help you with your obligation to people that were renting your space. Erez, I don't know what you're doing as far as renters in your space.
You know what I know.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, because, postponing rentals is also difficult, because then once we're legally allowed to open back up, we're going to be liable for our full rent at that moment, but then be having to fulfill our obligations to renters that we've postponed, right? So any, March, April, May, June renters are now going to try to use their time in the space in September, October, November. So we will still have no income for our small not-for-profit theaters, dance companies, and spaces.
And most likely we'll be operating at 50% capacity or less. So there's also that factor.
Right.
We have Katie Workham here. This is specific to her, them. I have a commercial lease for a dance studio and I'm trying to negotiate with my landlord. I was offered 50% for 4 months and he came back with 25 off for 2 months. Would you advise that I take this?
I would not. I mean, I think that is, your offer was, I think, very generous from the tenant's side. That I don't think, I mean, I guess it really is always dependent where it is in some respects, but that I don't feel is an acceptable offer from the landlord side. And again, one is just from market dynamics. I mean, I'm not sure who they would fill that space with, but just from a compassionate side is not really an offer that helps you at all. So,
and I'd also just encourage you again to think about how long could you be paying 50% of your rent with no income before you close your doors for good? And if you're forced to close your doors for good, do you have obligations that you need to pay artists before you pay your landlord that 50%? Think through how long you can keep your doors closed. I mean, have no income and be paying 50% of your rent. I think you were very generous to begin with. And so, it's your personal decision, but if you're going to pay, if you wanted to pay something, I would only pay what you were willing to pay. I wouldn't give a dime more than that.
I mean, the landlord is always going to try and they're always going to make threats. So I think it's just, they really are in a position not being able to do much of anything right now. So I do think certainly it's worthwhile to negotiate and try to quote strike a deal. But if any, what I've also seen is possibility maybe 50% of 1 month is maybe say you'll pay that at a later date and the end of the year. I mean, I have a gallery owner friend of mine, Lower East Side, who was saying 50% off for 3 months, but then actually was paying that on the back end of the lease, which I thought was, exceptionally generous on her side. So, which kind of was no discount at all, because in a way she was paying that rent at a later date. But if you want to make maybe a portion paid at a later date, maybe they would listen. But I don't think that is not a very nice offer from the landlord's perspective.
Yeah, and I think everybody has to be prepared to take a hit right now. This is the pain of this experience is going to have to be felt across the board, and our landlords are going to have to be prepared to pony up, or they're going to be vacant. They're going to be empty. That's just the reality.
This is the time for tenants to feel the power that you have.
Yeah.
Not a lot of times in New York City where tenants have power. Right now, you have no money, but you do have some power. The landlords, when we get back to whatever usual is after this, that they will have lost a lot of people. They will have lost a lot of businesses. There's not going to be the kind of pressure for apartments for a short period. There's not going to be the kind of pressure for commercial real estate if there was any. We have a moment of power, and this is the time to grab it.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is like getting crazy here, but we're even talking about how once we're back to renegotiate leases altogether, that, put some sort of runway into the lease where you're paying for 6 months, only 50% of a lower rent, like, can you take a look at your rent at the end of this and what the market is showing and renegotiate so that you're paying what is the current market rent versus the market rent when you signed your original lease.
Not the market rent that the landlord says.
Right, exactly. Not right, exactly.
I think also, just from my personal view, is, I don't know if Adam has an opinion on this, but certainly on the commercial side, if it ever comes to, litigation or something that is decided by a judge, will a judge decide that a tenant should have been paying rent when their whole business relies on attendance? I mean, that is such a wait and see. We don't know when that will ever be, and that could be well into the future. And I'm not sure if you're going to have a decision saying, no, you were responsible for paying your rent, your full rent during this whole time. Meanwhile, you weren't even allowed to conduct your business. So I think landlords could be at risk, when they say, if they're playing tough and just say, we're not going to negotiate, you have to pay your rent, that ultimately is the next decision. And how is that going to play out?
Yeah, in the residential context too, I think it's a very interesting question. I think historically, under principles of contract law and the way that courts have decided these things in the past, most data points point to, well, yeah, your rent is independent of your income or anything, but I think we just have to ourselves that this is like truly an unprecedented situation. Like, if you look at the employment of the last month, it puts the Great Recession of a decade ago to shame. It makes it look like absolutely nothing. And we're at a point where we need to be making these ambitious arguments, and we might see real changes in the law to sort of try to save everybody from this disaster.
Yeah.
So we have Orietta from Theater Lab. She says, we have 3 more years on our lease, and even if we are able to navigate this period, there's no way we can pay the old rent amount. What are the chances that we can renegotiate the monthly rent in order to be able to stay open?
I think that's exactly what we were just talking about. We actually think this is we will be able to renegotiate leases at the end of this. I think we need to get through this moment, see what legislation comes about, what's passed, if anything, and then we start renegotiating with our landlords. As a theater, Orietta is a participant in the IndieSpace Advisory and Consulting Program, but anybody who is not, that operates a venue, should become a part of our advisory and consulting program. So that way we can help with those conversations and negotiations with your landlords after this all settles down a bit. Paul Weiss-Rifkind has also taken us on as a client and has offered us some support in that area as well. And so, yes, the answer is yes. We are hoping that we should see some great renegotiation that would allow for our venues to ramp back up their work in an affordable way.
Is there
I
any
would, yeah, sorry. I was just going to add, I think any discussion about that, I think you should, and I think it definitely should happen, it should be, I think, altogether discussion, the immediate relief and long-term, because just from a negotiation standpoint and just a practical matter, just knowing exactly what you can afford, it should be all encompassing, the immediate relief and long-term, I think. I wouldn't do it phased, like, do something immediate relief and then go back to the landlord later. I would do it all at once.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's a way for us to have a conversation with landlords at this time to say, in order to keep our venue open long term, these are the things that we need to do in order to make it at all possible so that you don't have vacant space in this building.
There's going to be nobody standing in line behind you to grab your space. Your landlord knows that. You have a little bit of power here that you don't normally have.
Yeah.
Okay. JP asks, is there any sort of duty to mitigate for commercial tenants who feel they need to cancel their lease?
Isn't there? It's usually in the termination clause. I don't know if there's a duty to mitigate. I mean, I think it depends on your individual lease, right, Paul?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question totally. I agree with Randy. I mean, I guess it really depends on what's in the lease specifically. But I mean, I'm not sure. I think it's more, I just think it's reviewing that specific lease.
Well, right. And that is the kind of thing that you can send to us, and we're happy to take a look at your lease and see if there's something within your lease that allows you to terminate, if that's the choice that you're making.
Okay, it seems like we have 2 more questions about residential rentals. Here we go. Gregory goes, I want to put up a flyer under every door of my apartment building starting a rent strike. I'd appreciate suggestions as to the phrasing of the announcement. What kind of leverage can we claim?
So I think that's a good idea. Rather than going into this at too much length, I want to refer you to material that have been already assembled and are available online from the Right to Counsel Coalition in New York City. They've a whole packet, includes some suggested language for communicating with your fellow tenants, for communicating with landlord, and then there are also sort of sign-in sheets or whatever where you can get connected up with the statewide campaign. In general, when you phrase it to the other tenants, I think the points to emphasize in there, if I were putting it together, would be, look, we're all in the same boat here. This is, again, a really unprecedented crisis. So many people are having trouble paying their rent right now. And then 2, there is power in numbers. There is sort of relief we can get if we stick together, both on a sort of governmental level for rent cancellation, and with respect to this particular landlord for getting, rent waiver or reduction. Though I guess those would be the major points that I want to emphasize in the community, the other tenants.
And can you see the name of the website they should go to again for templates?
Yeah, the group is the New York City Right to Counsel Coalition. I'll dig up the URL right now and I'll drop it in the chat.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Our next question is from Shauna. Along these lines of warranty of habitability, does a kitchen window that was boarded up years ago because a building was built right up against our kitchen window and the landlord put up a board where our kitchen window once was, is that a situation where we can advocate for a reduced rent?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, and one thing that sometimes happens is that in New York City, we build so dense that somebody's own landlord doesn't necessarily have control over what happens even, a foot outside their tenant's window. But certainly it sounds like you're now living in an apartment that has less light, has less airflow, has fewer features than you initially bargained for, and so that gives you sort of a foothold to make like a persuasive argument with your landlord. I'd want to look into the particular issue, but it may even give rise to an actual legal defense in the event you were fighting with your landlord about a payment issue.
So they live in a rent stabilized apartment. What documentation should they keep to prove rent forgiveness because of COVID-19?
Some of the proposals for the rent cancellation are contingent upon the tenant being able to demonstrate some sort of loss of income, and so it's going to vary from person to person exactly how they document their income. If you're somebody who sort of makes an annual wage and that wage has been reduced, hours have been reduced, I'd imagine that would be reflected on the sort of the checks you receive or the deposits that you get into your bank account. You could retain that sort of information. If you're a person whose income is off the books, how you could most credibly document that. Maybe it's if it's not something you already do, maybe it's sort of trying to create some sort of ledgering system where you can reflect both this is money 2 months ago and this is the sort of money that I'm making now.
Yeah, we've also
So-
suggested a Google Calendar that could show previous work versus not for folks that are undocumented or might not have income through a W, through a W-2 or 4, whatever. But so also for 1099 and for gig workers, because gig workers are being included in a lot of these packages, it's important that you show maybe what the income was that you made last year and show what you made the first couple of months of this year. Any way that you can with 1099s that you might have received, with your calendar, with emails of cancellations of gigs, with closures.
Okay, and it seems like JK is looking for advice. I received a PPP loan and usually deduct a third of for my home office. So I could either pay a third, sorry, 1 second. So I could either pay a third with the PPP or could put a portion aside and pay at the end. I already paid my rent in full for April.
Just so you know, the PPP only allows you to use 25% towards any rent. So as far as documentation that you might need to provide for PPP, make sure you only put aside 25%, not a third. And this is a personal decision. If you've paid your full rent in April, you have to decide what, you've now had a full month without any income potentially. So I would put it aside. I mean, that's what I would do. If you feel like you can and you have the room with that grant to put money aside and just hold it in the event that you're going to be liable for the rent when you're back up and running, that's what I would do. I wouldn't give away the money to the landlord and then put myself in a position to not be able to deliver on that going forward.
Let me just fine tune on that. It's not 25% for rent. It's 75% for payroll. And the 25% is for all the other expenses, your rent, your Con Edison, your insurance, your all of it. You can't exceed 25%, or else it won't turn into a grant if it has a chance of turning into a grant.
So I think that's all the questions we have, but we did have some participants share some resources, such as Amy Todoroff with the League of Independent Theater. They commented, this is the press release, they attached a link from BK Borough President Eric Adams that Randy mentioned earlier regarding applying security deposits to current rent. They attached a link to that, as well as...
Wait, can I say one thing on that though? The idea is that you will have to re-deposit your security deposit though. So far, it's that they can use the security deposit for now and kind of release those funds into the universe in order to pay the landlord, but you're going to have to put the security deposit back. So it's not like you're getting a free month. Well, it's not even free anyway. You paid it to begin with. So I just want to. It's an option. It's trying, but please just keep in mind that if that is something that you as a tenant decide you want to enact, if that goes through, you will have to redeposit your security deposit. However, I wonder, Adam, legally, if there is less they can do if you're behind on your security deposit than they can if you're actually behind on your rent. I don't know if they can really go after you for your security deposit in the same way that they can for back rent.
Yeah, I think as a general rule, they cannot.
Okay.
And so they make money claim for your security deposit, but I don't believe that they could have failing to repay that security.
Okay. So that's an option, but they will ask for the money back later.
Thank you for that, Randy and Adam. So Amy later also attached a different link going to Senator Gennari's statement. It's regarding COVID and and the bills related to that. And we had another participant, I'm scrolling to find it. We have Gregory saying, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the brilliant Douglas Street Music Collective, which functioned very well for a few years. simply by having each member pay a fraction of the rent on a different day or days of each month, giving them access to the space for those days each month. It might be a good model for performing artists going forward who want to keep moving forward.
So like a shared rent expense, collective rent. I like it.
So yeah, so that's all the questions we've got from our participants. Thank you so much, Randi, Erez, Paul, and Adam for being here with us today. I hope this was very informative for our participants. And thank you everyone for being here. For those of you who are members with us, we will be archiving this recording. You will get a link from us soon as to how to access that. And Randi, I think you had some resources you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that if people are interested in participating in the advisory and consulting program with IndieSpace, they can email us at info@indiespace.org. And our advisory and consulting program is free for artists. So you should reach out to us and let us help you navigate your real estate challenges during this time. And we're happy to just answer any questions. We're in communication with Adam, and I'm sure we could shoot him a question as well on the residential side. Oh, thanks for putting that there. I see you added it to the, and then also you can email that email address, and I'm happy. It just got very loud over here. Sorry if something's happening. I'm also happy to send over templates of landlord notices. So I can send that to you, Natalie, if you want to share with everybody, or people are welcome to email us and start a relationship with us one-on-one so that we can support their specific, need.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Have a nice day, everyone.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you.